My name's Bruce Bennett. I'm the Programme Director for Film Studies in LICA at Lancaster. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction and then hand over to Christopher Frayling for the opening paper. This event emerged from a conversation we had with Christopher about a year ago concerning under-researched and neglected areas of film studies and cultural history, neglected areas of cinematic practice and film history. And production design was an area that we quickly identified as a key concern, along with sound design, which we're intending is going to be the focus of a follow-up event later this year. The title was suggested by Professor Frayling. And it's an invitation to look differently and anew at an aspect of cinema and television and related media, an aspect that's both over-familiar and largely overlooked. And so today's event will explore a range of approaches to the analysis of production design, the process of designing the appearance of the sets, locations and spaces of films, TV programs and other audiovisual media. In the words of Jim Bissell, who worked on E.T., in designing sets, the production designer is creating a machine for shooting. And in the words of Ken Adam, who Christopher's written about and interviewed, and who worked on Kubrick's Dr Strangelove and Barry Lyndon, among other films, the production designer's job is not to reproduce a real space or a real place, but to create the persuasive idea of a space through a stylized representation of it. The critical oversight with regard to production design is all the more striking, given that it's such a prominent focus for popular publications on films. The film sections of most bookshops contain lavish, extraordinarily expensive books on the concept art, costumes, sets and visual effects of many mainstream films. The release of most contemporary big-budget films on DVD and Blu-ray almost always involves the addition of making-of documentaries, which suggests that production design and the process of film production is of considerable interest to film audiences and is a major source of pleasure as well. There are a number of reasons why academics have tended to disregard production design. The first is what we might call a paradoxical visibility. While on the one hand it's perhaps the most immediately obvious element of the film image, it's also, as Rick Carter, who's a frequent collaborator with Spielberg in film and television productions, as Rick Carter observes, designed literally not to be seen. Perhaps it's best described as a magician's illusion, he explains. You're looking right at it, but if you're aware of it, it means you're not suspending your disbelief. And in this respect, for Carter, production design for mainstream film and television has a primary classical function. It functions to support the narrative. Invisibility is a professional goal and a measure of technical accomplishment for the designer. Although, of course, this varies across genres and national contexts. The films of Peter Greenaway and Wes Anderson, for example, make a central feature of the designs by Ben Van Os and Mark Friedberg. There are several possible reasons for the academic disregard for production design. These include the overvaluation of the director as a creative composer of the film, which is an emphasis that's been codified through auteur theory in relation to film studies and involves a misunderstanding of the collaborative process of film and TV production. Michael Winterbottom, the British director, is very sort of scathing about auteur theory, the fetishization of the director as author. So it's a bourgeois romantic concept that involves a complete misunderstanding of the industrial process. Another reason is a caricaturing insistence upon the industrial process of film production as equivalent to a factory assembly line in which the technicians are simply factory workers rather than sort of creative artists. Third reason is the difficulty academics have in getting access to sets and studio offices, the spaces in which production companies operate. A further reason is the disregard with which some film and television companies treat the material that's generated in the development of production of a film or a TV series. They've tended not to be very systematic or rigorous in preserving and archiving sketches, miniatures, matte paintings, costumes, and so on. I worked very briefly as a set painter at Pinewood Studios in the early 1990s. And one of the things that struck me very strongly was the wastefulness of the process. We'd spend quite a lot of time making beautiful, elaborate sets, which might be used for perhaps a day or two to be filmed on, and then they'd be destroyed, smashed up, and thrown into skips. And finally, there's a certain lack of agreement or certainty over what a production designer does, since they come from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds: theatre, architecture, interior design, graphic design, fashion, fine art, as well as increasingly from specialised courses in film schools. And this confusion over roles and responsibilities has perhaps been heightened with the increased prominence of digital visual effects as a component or an extension of production design. So what's at stake in turning a critical eye upon the processes of production design and recognising the central role of the production designer is the acknowledgement of an invisible history of the labour and creative expression of thousands of women and men. And secondly, attention to the complex creative process involved in designing the appearance of a film or a TV programme or a stage play, or increasingly a video game. What's at stake in this is a demystification of the finished image that invites us to scrutinise the formal intricacy and the semiotic complexity of the screen with a newly alert eye. The work that's been done on production design and designers draws on a variety of approaches: ethnographies, interviews, industrial histories, as well as close textual analysis, and studies of the work of individual designers as well is beginning to make a case for their status as artists or auteurs. And hopefully what will emerge from these papers today and the discussions around them is both an exploration of the ways in which we might look differently at stages, narrative space, and on-screen images, as well as a clearer view of the role of the production designer. So we're going to begin with a paper by Christopher Frayling on perspectives on production design. This is the schedule for the day, followed by a buffet lunch in the foyer outside. Christopher Frayling, I'm sure you know, needs no introduction. He's most recently been responsible for co-curating the Hollywood costume exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's widely published in the areas of sort of cultural history and film. I'm familiar with his work, or I came upon his work first of all for in relation to his groundbreaking books on spaghetti westerns, Italian westerns from the 1960s and 70s, and his biography of Sergio Leone, both of which are intensely recommended, strongly recommended. They're fantastic books. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to Christopher.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. Yes, I'm just recovering from Hollywood costume at the V&A, which was a really mammoth undertaking. And by the way, can you hear me okay? Yeah. And which closed last Sunday. And it was a very interesting example of one of the themes of today, because it opened in October, and the art critics in the papers were scared of it because it had the word Hollywood. The fashion critics were scared of it because it was film. The film critics don't write about exhibitions on the whole, except occasionally Ian in Sight and Sound as a sort of preview. And it sort of slipped between all sorts of stools. Meanwhile, the public, 250,000 people came to it in 2 months. So the word got round because people felt they could identify with this material either nostalgically or critically or in lots of different ways. But I think it was a very good example of the fact that design in film exists at the intersection of all sorts of areas and itself hasn't defined a sort of territory which people feel confident in. And it does mean that very little critical debate has happened. The show finished with Dorothy's gingham dress from The Wizard of Oz, 1939, with her ruby slippers. And that's an example of another aspect of film design, which is partly it's to do with the afterlife of film. That costume has become an icon within the gay culture, hugely, and nothing to do with the film at all. It's been sort of detached from its film context and become part of the afterlife of film through images, which again is another part of the story. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about, broadly, to introduce the day, some perspectives on production design, some of the things that have been written, and some of the problems, and some of the opportunities, because I think that Lancaster is very well placed to develop some sort of specialism in production design as a bridge between film studies and design, which nobody's actually succeeded in doing. There's more material than you'd think, actually, around, but mainly archival, rather than getting into current productions where it's all sort of commercially sensitive and so on. Anyway, Citizen Kane, as I'm sure you all know, opens with a sequence entirely made up of a series of paintings of Xanadu Palace, supplemented by miniatures, models, live action and props in the foreground, and punctuated by a series of optical dissolves. The Grand Palace on the hill, like its celebrated owner, has all sorts of jarring elements which make sense from a distance, but which on closer inspection seem like suspicious rhetorical flourishes. The overall structure of the palace was based partly on the fairy tale castle in Snow White, then a recent release, partly on William Randolph Hearst's Saint Simeon, a real-life house, partly on Mont Saint-Michel, and the individual details gleaned from standard architectural picture books included the campanile of St. Marco in Venice, on the right, the colonnade of the Palazzo Pitti in Florence, that's the colonnade in the foreground, a Victorian Gothic arched entrance, the rose window in Chartres Cathedral, the battlements of a medieval fortress, and the roof of one of Ludwig of Bavaria's mad castles, all put together into Xanadu. With today's art and paste software, the visual assembly of these elements would be very straightforward. It would take a matter of minutes. But in 1941, it involved the laborious preparation with oils and large brushes. And you always use large brushes for these paintings because too much detail makes it look flat and dead. Of a series of matte paintings, matte meaning a mask used to block out part of the image and to allow another to be substituted. In the case of Xanadu, the iron railings and Kane's private zoo were added in the foreground for verisimilitude. Now, the paintings were by a man called Chesley Bonestell, who was later to create some very influential images of astronauts, rockets, and space travel for Collier's magazine in the 1950s. And anyone who's seen any of those early 50s science fiction films like Destination Moon, his drawings come into all of them. In fact, he created that image of space. And a team assembled by Orson Welles at RKO Studio. But of course, they were never intended to be examined in the kind of detail I've just used. This matte painting was on the screen for a total of 4 seconds, just enough to stop the audience suspecting an illusion. So one issue about production design is we can freeze the frame, we can get very detailed, we can be forensic, you can talk about these sort of case studies, but of course that wasn't what they were intended to be. They were intended to be projected at 24 frames per second very quickly, so that actually the artificiality didn't show. But nevertheless, one approach is to use the kind of detail I've used. The great film director Michael Powell, about whom Ian has written much, wrote in his autobiography, A Life in the Movies, "It is not generally recognized by the public that the most genuinely creative member of a film unit, if the author of the original story and screenplay is excluded, is the art director. In the film world, the producer and director and cameraman are so full of themselves that it's not sufficiently acknowledged that the art director is the creator of those marvelous images up there on the screen." And he wrote this, of course, as a film director who was very aware of the visual side of filmmaking. In fact, of course, in his early days, he cut his teeth working with Hitchcock, who equally was aware of the visual, a graduate of evening classes at Goldsmiths, who always saw the value of pre-production drawings and design as a very strong element of his films. So he had strong views on this. But he could have added that it's not just a question of public recognition. Within the specialized world of film studies, as we've heard, the art director or the production designer have been at least equally neglected. Where biographical approaches to film studies are concerned, first it was the turn of the stars, then the directors, then the writers, and most recently, a few interesting books on cinematographers. I'm not including those picture books. Where thematic approaches to film studies are concerned, first it was the turn of the authors, the directors again, but for some reason, the people who created much of the physical content of the graphic frame have been largely left out. This isn't for lack of research materials, although they are sometimes difficult to find. The archives are actually full and getting fuller of sketches, illustrations, storyboards, and production photos, not to mention the reference materials used by art directors and production designers, plus, of course, the evidence of the films themselves. Sometimes even the models have survived, although this is much, much rarer because, of course, three-dimensional things take up lots of space, so they tend to get junked. There was the famous MGM auction of 1970 where they sold everything. But as I discovered when doing Hollywood costume, there's a sort of penumbra of a sort of subculture surrounding California where matte paintings, drawings, costumes, bits of the material culture of film exist within collections because people bought them at that 1970 auction. But there they are, tucked away, and you have to get into that sort of subculture in order to understand where they are. But things that take up space on the whole get junked. I think it's more to do, I believe, with the literary and historical roots of most film studies and a general reluctance to deal at this level with the visual. The person or team most responsible for the look of a finished feature film, in partnership with the cinematographer and director, translating the written script into visualizations, creating the color palette, selecting the architectural and interior details, helping to choose the locations, designing and decorating the sets, coordinating the costumes, makeup and hairstyles, helping to structure each sequence, evolving a distinct and coherent look for films where necessary, that person is more often than not the art director or production designer. Of course, leading a team, as you rightly say, in industrial circumstances of art director, assistants, set decorators, craftspeople, draftspeople, technicians, builders, carpenters, etc., plasterers and prop buyers. So there's a whole team of people underneath the production designer, but fundamentally in the core team that evolves how a film will look, director, cinematographer, production designer, and sometimes costume designer. So why is it that, you know, that key member of the team has been missed out? And I don't know about you, but I'm not very good at remembering lines of dialogue from film. I usually misremember them like everybody else. You know, I mean, you know, she didn't say, "Come up and see me sometime," and he doesn't say, "Play it again, Sam." And these things get into the vernacular rather inaccurately. But I do very distinctly remember visual moments from films and can conjure them up. And maybe I'm unusual in this. Georges Méliès's Rocket to the Moon or his Quest to the Pole, the streets of Holstenval in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the Sheriff of Nottingham's Castle in the Douglas Fairbanks Robin Hood, the city centre of Metropolis, the yellow brick road to Oz, the modern airport at the end of Casablanca, Xanadu, the Bates Motel with the gingerbread Gothic mansion on the hill, the wooden ranch house in Monument Valley where there aren't any trees, the megalomaniac operations room in middle period James Bond, the streets of Los Angeles in the year 2018 in Blade Runner. And these are just the most obvious designs, but to me they're very, very clear in my head, and they're part of the afterlife of the film that I mentioned, that I take away. They have a strange way of stage managing our perception of how things look, as actually the introduction mentioned. For example, at an American Film Institute seminar, the film director George Roy Hill of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid fame was once informed by a member of the audience. I don't know if you remember in Butch Cassidy, they go to Bolivia. And they arrive at the station in Bolivia, and what tells you it's Bolivia is there are two llamas standing there, right? And someone from the audience who happened to be from Bolivia said, "I'm sorry, there aren't any llamas in Bolivia." And he paused for a moment and replied, "Well, there are now." And of course, the thing is, in our mind, anybody who's seen Butch Cassidy, the first thing you know about Bolivia is the llamas, even though in real life they aren't there. There's something about the medium of film that enables it to imprint images on the mind that are more real than the real world. So southern plantation houses look like Tara, airports look like Casablanca, motels look like the down the hill bit of the Bates family establishment, albeit without the house on the hill. And the postmodern city centre, as William Gibson of Neuromancer has written, has come increasingly to resemble the retrofitted chaos of Blade Runner, that life actually is imitating art. Several of the production designs of Ken Adam, which were featured in an exhibition at the Serpentine Gallery and about which I've written quite a lot, are classic examples of this. The gigantic war room in Dr Strangelove, one part concrete bomb shelter, one part light ring illuminating a global poker game, one part animated map or scoreboard showing the flight paths of nuclear weapons, 3 parts paranoia, has since 1963 been everyone's idea of what the inner sanctum of the Pentagon must look like. In fact, when President Ronald Reagan was sworn in, when he first went to the Pentagon, he asked to be shown the war room. Mr. President, I'm afraid there isn't one. But of course there is at some level, because it's in all our minds. Another example is Fort Knox in Goldfinger, where Ken said this: in reality, no vault would ever look like that, because you'd never stack gold more than a couple of feet high. It's very, very heavy, and the floor would collapse. I've seen that for myself at the Bank of England. The gold would be much too difficult to move about. But I decided to stack the gold up 40 feet high, which would look interesting for the biggest gold depository in the world. After all, the public wanted to see gold. We have to convince people about your visual ideas. I showed a sketch to the producer. It looks like a prison, he said. What are you trying to do? You can't do that. I replied, the gold is behind bars and we look at it from the outside, which makes us immediately aware of it. And he bought that. The strange thing is, after the film came out, United Artists received something like 300 letters which said, why is it that the Bond crew were allowed inside Fort Knox when the President of the United States hasn't got that permission? Everyone is now convinced that Fort Knox looks like that. As a film designer, you can create a reality which is more acceptable to the public than the actual thing. I'm sure the inside of Fort Knox is very dull, with low vaults and a few trolleys. I've never been there. To put it another way, as the great Ernst Lubitsch put it, all about those wonderful designs at Paramount of European city centres designed by Hans Dreyer, who was the head of design at Paramount. It was The Merry Widow and all those films. They were famous for their European sets. He wrote, there is Paramount Paris, and Metro Paris, and RKO Paris, and Universal Paris, and of course there's the real Paris, but Paramount Paris is the most Parisian of them all. He continued, to continue the Parisian theme, on one famous occasion, Cedric Gibbons, the supervising art director at MGM, complained to his boss, that Irving Thalberg, when he was asked to come up with a moonlit ocean in Paris. A moonlit ocean in Paris? Thalberg instantly replied, whatever you put there, Cedric, they'll believe it. So, one aspect of this is studying a kind of reality that's greater than reality, and exactly, how does that process work? Actually, the next bit sort of covers really. I was trying to speculate about why it is that production design has not had the kind of attention that I would argue that it deserves, and it is partly to do with the development of film studies and the idea of the author. It's partly, I think, the basis of many film studies in literature and language theory rather than more visual disciplines. It's partly the inability of art historians to come to terms with film from the other side of the equation. It's partly the reticence of film designers themselves, who, as anyone who's interviewed them, they're very much backroom boys and girls, and they don't push themselves forward. They've bought the director as author in a big way themselves, and don't, they're always amazed that you're showing any interest in them. And it's partly, from the scholarly point of view, the difficulty of establishing exactly who did what. Now, one of the things about Hollywood costume, rather like production design, is that, as I'll be talking about a little bit later on, the credits don't necessarily tell you who did it. In Hollywood films from the late 20s through till the mid-50s, the credits tell you who the supervising art director was, who the head of department was, the head of the design department, who by contract had to be mentioned on every single film. Sometimes you get underneath their name the actual associate art director who is responsible for this particular film, but not always and not very often. So it's a piece of archaeology to discover, who signed the drawing, to try and do the paper chase to work out exactly where these drawings came from, and that itself is actually quite difficult. Sorry, I'm getting a bit muddled here. Yeah. There are various books that have been written about film design that I want to talk about a bit. And, sorry, I missed I should have done this, typed it out, but there we are. There are various books, and some of them deal with approaches that are worth thinking about. One of them is a book by Anne Hollander, which looks at, and I've got a list of these actually, which I can give you, which looks at the film design through fine art, the way in which designers use the famous paintings as a shortcut to design. So you keep seeing paintings turning up in productions, and it's not a piece of art history. You don't say, well, there's lots of footnotes and it matters what the painting is, but it's a shortcut for helping out designers. And in fact, when in the golden age of Hollywood in the 1930s and 40s, most design departments had what they called a Bible, which was a collection of transparencies, reproductions, photographs, art reproductions, postcards, cuttings, and catalogue entries and all sorts of things. And each production would be allocated a Bible, which is a visual world that the film should belong to. And in those Bibles were all sorts of famous paintings. And because a lot of the film designers actually came from Northern Europe as émigrés, a lot of the paintings related to art history of Northern Europe in all sorts of different ways. That really does need studying, I think. But just before I get to that, here's Ken's drawing for Fort Knox. This amazing, he went to the Bank of England and saw that these tiny little piles of gold were going around on reinforced trolleys, but decided that looked like nothing. So let's make it look like this. Rather alarmingly, the architect Norman Foster has said that he's been inspired in all sorts of ways by Ken Adams' sets for the baddies in James Bond, only they're in the real world, which is slightly scary. Okay, that's Fort Knox. But, okay, just this idea of the relationship of production design to paintings. This is Arnold Böcklin, The Isle of the Dead, a painting of the late 19th century. Not awfully well known in England, but very well known in Europe, a symbolist painting. This is Skull Island in King Kong. Again, it appears very briefly. You wouldn't really register it. It's directly taken from The Isle of the Dead. Granville's illustration to Gulliver's Travels, which was part of the Bible for King Kong. I hate to disillusion you, but this was the size of the ape going up the Empire State Building. Caspar David Friedrich, a man and woman staring at the moon, 1819, with the oak tree, symbol of German nationalism, tottering. This keeps turning up. Student of Prague, 1920s. Tom Sawyer, late 1930s, designed by Lyle Wheeler in Hollywood. That tree, it even turns up in Snow White. Oskar Schlemmer, costume design from the Bahaus. Maybe Nosferatu. But actually, I think there's a closer artistic thing, as we'll see. Francis Bacon, three figures at the base of the crucifixion, 1944. There's the figure in the middle. Alien by Hans Rudi Giger, the Swiss surrealist. And this is acknowledged. I'm not saying they pinched it, it's a shortcut. Life's too short. You're moving fast, there's a project going. How do I sort out my visual problem? Let's use a Bible. This is Edward Hopper, The House by the Rail Yard. Anyone got this one? Thank you very much. No, Psycho. Yeah, where Clatworthy, the designer, acknowledged the source. There aren't actually that many gingerbread Gothic houses. In the Truffaut-Hitchcock interview, you get the impression that California is absolutely full of these clapboard gingerbread Gothic houses looking like something out of Hansel and Gretel. Actually, they're quite rare, but Edward Hopper's painting had one. Fuseli's painting, Zurich-born painter, came to London, 1782, The Nightmare. This keeps turning up. Frankenstein, 1931, they actually used this as part of the publicity. And instead of the horse and the nightmare at the window, it's Karloff. They put it on the poster, the bottom of the poster. And I thought that must be the first use of it, but actually this is Edison's Frankenstein of 1910, and it's sort of similar. Sorry about the quality of the still, but the original is not in very good nick. Said to be the first major horror film, Edison, 1910. Caligari. Production drawing by Albin Grau for Nosferatu. I think that's really where the bald head and the creature comes from The Nightmare. This is the only drawing of Frankenstein which we know that Mary Shelley approved from the 1831 popular edition of Frankenstein, where the creature, as in the book, is initially beautiful. He's been pieced together from body parts to make him a sort of Vitruvian man, you know, optimal person, but there's something strange about his eyes, because what's going on inside is a bit weird, and the whole allegory is about he becomes ugly because people treat him as ugly. Of course, that's a little bit complicated for Hollywood. Here's the drawing with the research student's about 18 years old, Frankenstein. You know, he's sort of doing his PhD on body parts and looks back at this postpartum moment. And this is how it ends up in Hollywood, where you have to be literal about the scars, which Mary Shelley didn't worry about, and the bolt in the neck and the big cranium, because audiences want a bit of an explanation of how this thing was put together. In the case of the novel, Mary Shelley simply says, I gathered the instruments of life around me, full stop. That's it. It's a whole reel of the movie, because you've got to have the operation and the lightning arc generator and the scars and all this sort of stuff. That's the role of the production designer. This is thought to have been in the Bible for Frankenstein. It's a Goya print called Los Chinchilas about some lunatic Spanish aristocrats, and the one on the left is thought to be the origin of Karloff's makeup. So a shortcut again. It looks remarkably like him. Actually, they got the period right. Did they but know it? It's a good piece of art history, but they weren't awfully interested in that. I'm afraid I collect these examples. You know, it's this is Dorothy Lamour with Tiger, and you could say that they'd been to see Douanier Rousseau's famous painting at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Maybe. There's lots of tigers, lions wandering around with ladies with guitars and so on. So that's one approach. You can go to production design through art history. Art historians find this very difficult because it's about the diffusion of art, about the dissemination of art, the way art gets into the public bloodstream rather than about the art. But nevertheless, it is one approach, and Anne Hollander's book actually talks about that. There's a very interesting book by Charles and Mirella Affron called Sets in Motion, 1998, which looks at the contribution of set design to film narrative and serving the story, and treats the movie set as, quote, the point where visual culture, industry, the politics of the collaborative process, and narrative all intersect. It's the one attempt I know, maybe Ian knows others, but to really bring together film theory and production design, this book. Sometimes, say the Affrons, the set is the prime organizing feature of the narrative, encoding all sorts of information that in a novel you'd have to describe, but in a movie it's encoded visually. It's a shortcut. So you learn an awful lot about the characters, how they live, their social class, their income, you know, their attitude to life, the moment you see the set. And sometimes it's the, you know, the organizing feature of the narrative, and at the same time it says a lot, in the case of Hollywood, about the studio which produced it. One very interesting thing about the Hollywood system is that most of the movie moguls were from the fashion business. Glove salesmen, furriers, etc. And they had a really strong sense of how to use design, a really strong sense. And the design departments of the Hollywood studios were really very large departments. And so they quickly realized that if you're going to do corporate imaging, one aspect of corporate imaging is to develop a distinctive look for the studio. And first of all, they developed those wonderful logos that we all recognize, you know, the lion, the universe for Universal, the lady with the torch for Columbia, etc. You know, we all know the 20th Century Fox, searchlights. But more than that, there was a look for each of the studios, under the direction of the supervising art director, which meant that within seconds of the film starting, you knew which studio had produced it. MGM, big white sets, evenly lit, everything absolutely huge. I mean, a film noir made by MGM is completely different to a film noir made by Warner's, where it's more like a film gris. It's a sort of grey film rather than a dark film. Warner's, much lower budget, lots of shadows, lots of expressionism, making up for the budgets with you know, gaps in the sets with lots of shadows, etc. Universal, under a British-trained architect called Charles Hall, who first went over to America with Fred Karno and the Music Hall, and ends up at Universal. And his trademark was those tongue-in-cheek Gothic sets, larger-than-life Gothic sets, which are sort of not meant to be taken too seriously, with crosses at a strange angle, giant baronial halls, steps, you know, all the rest of it. So, you know, it's part of the unique selling proposition of the studios is the look that they develop under the supervising art director. And the Afrons are very good on that. And there's a book by Vincent Labruto, By Design, 1992, which adopts a biographical approach and makes a plea for interviewing as many people as possible before they go and examining their papers before it's too late. If you go to the Margaret Herrick Library in Hollywood, most of the interviews are with directors and sometimes cinematographers and writers. There are very, very few interviews with elderly production designers, and it's such a shame because a lot of those people have gone. I mean, Ken's 93 now. And I think, you know, make great student projects or research projects to do oral histories with these people as a record, because otherwise there's no trace at all except in private collections. And By Design is a plea for that before it's too late. As I say, I think I want to look at, really, in the middle part of this talk, at two approaches, the fine art approach and the studio approach, before focusing on a couple of case studies. As I say, Anne Hollander, in Moving Pictures, explores ways in which the works of various painters, Vermeer for lighting, Caspar David Friedrich for the composition of landscapes, John Martin for large-scale disasters, and if you know John Martin's paintings, it's all about, you know, Babylon being destroyed and the Great Wave and the end of the world. He was terribly influential, particularly in the early days of Cecil B. DeMille, have turned into the way of showing moments in the narrative flow of life within American and European culture, from paintings to prints to photographs to films to visual cliches. Other studies have shown how film designers have used paintings and prints as ways of organizing the design of their image, partly as shortcuts, partly because they anticipate that these visualizations will be read in certain ways. The Fuseli, I think, is a very good example of that. You want woman in peril, lying on bed, Fuseli is your man. Even now, actually. Fun enough, I was reading, someone sent me a copy of the Fortean Times. There's no end to one's research interest in this, all about alien visitations. They all look like Fuseli. It's strange, it's sort of in people's heads. That's what visitations at night look like. And these creatures sitting on people's chests all bear a very strong resemblance. There's an area. Raymond Derniat, the late critic, wrote that designers can dissolve the conventional distinction between photographic, realistic, and painterly, artificial. They don't photograph a world, they build a painting. It's a very nice way of putting it, I think. So it's not necessarily the relationship with the real world that's interesting, it's building a painting. And hence those paintings that I showed you as an example. As I say, they don't mention the Bibles, but some of them have survived. For example, the Bible for Citizen Kane has survived, and there's a book by a man called Robert Carringer on the making of Citizen Kane, which in great detail looks at the Bible they used when making, with lots of pictures from architectural textbooks and so on. I'll be talking about those in a minute. Sometimes, if you're lucky, the Bible has survived. Otherwise, you have to reconstruct it from the visuals of the film. And sometimes the Bible was actually used as part of the selling point of the film. It's quite interesting. Hollywood, on the whole, was suspicious of professional historians. You know, when they got them in as technical advisors, they usually regretted it. Too abstract, not interested enough in personalities and great individuals, and not practical enough about details. But they used historical accuracy of the sets as a selling point. And there's a very good example, which I came across when doing Hollywood costume, and that's Marie Antoinette, which was made in 1938. MGM, huge sets, and this is the campaign book. During the 4 years in which the picture was in preparation, 59,277 questions were answered. It's an extraordinary thing to say. 59,277 questions were answered. This required compiling a bibliography of 1,538 volumes, gathering 10,615 photographs, paintings and sketches, and mimeographing 5,000 pages of manuscript containing more than 3 million words. That's on the campaign book. That's a selling point, is the amount of research that went into it. According to Peter Bull, who was one of the actors in Marie Antoinette, it was so over-designed that they should have changed the title to Marie and Toilette. But anyway, so, you know, lots and lots of research on the surface details, because one of the tricks of these films is to get the surface details absolutely right. Of course, the moment anyone opens their mouth, the illusion is quickly broken. But verisimilitude of surface detail is terribly important in most of these sets. So the use of research is very important. And as a way into film design, this idea of fine art is interesting, implying as it does a diffusion model for the spread of images, but it tends to isolate the results from the technical processes which produce them, and to forget the collaborative nature of filmmaking. As I say, the main team of production designer, cinematographer, director, the fine art approach tends to remove the images from the context they were produced in to look at them as pure visual language. But it does tell you some things. 2 exhibitions of the last decade, I think, highlight the pitfalls. One was called Storyboard, Le Cinéma Dessiné, and it was shown at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, which exhibited assorted storyboard drawings by Peter Greenaway, Terry Gilliam, Carlos Saura, Ken Adam and others, put them in frames and set them next to the stills from the films which they referred to. And it seemed to be claiming that the storyboards in their own right had the status of art drawings. Originally, of course, they were working drawings which helped to stimulate story conferences or helped to budget the film or helped to organize the way the film was to be shot, but they were never intended to be freestanding artifacts. They were intended to be thrown away. Sometimes they've survived because people keep them, but it's basically jottings. They're part of a chain or process from script to screen, and they were often thrown away after they'd done their job. Storyboards did have an important impact on the history of film design, though, when they contributed to the change of title and status from art director to production designer in 1939. When Gone with the Wind was being made, as we know, producer David O. Selznick hired and fired 4 directors, including Victor Fleming and George Cukor and others, and several directors of photography. But the one constant on the creative team of Gone with the Wind was the art director, William Cameron Menzies, whose storyboards provided the visual basis for the entire shoot. 1,000 small watercolor drawings for each setup and each lighting setup, very, very carefully, and the whole kind of visual coordination, the arc of the story. And in fact, Cameron Menzies even directed 10% of the movie. He wasn't a great director, but he was a great production designer. And Selznick sent one of his famous memos on September the 1st, 1937. I feel that we need a man of Menzies' talent and enormous experience on the sets of this picture and on its physical production. I hope to have Gone with the Wind prepared almost down to the last camera angle before we start shooting, because on this picture, really thorough preparation will save hundreds of thousands of dollars. Accordingly, if we do go ahead with Menzies, he will start on the Wind sets directly he finishes work on Tom Sawyer. He may turn out to be one of the most valuable factors in properly producing this picture. One of the minor problems in connection with this arrangement is the matter of Menzies' credit. Menzies is terribly anxious not to get back to art direction as such, and of course his work on this picture, as I see it, will be a lot greater in scope than is normally associated with the term art direction. Accordingly, I would probably give him some such credit as production designed by William Cameron Menzies. And that was the first use of production designer in Hollywood history, because he'd provided the entire visual world and, of course, saved a fortune, because each camera setup, I'll give you just a flavour of his drawings. This is what they look like, and there's 1,000 of them. So this is escaping from the burning of Atlanta, and they've survived. Cameron Menzies had been around for a long time. He designed in the silent era, was involved in fact, got the first Academy Award for art direction in 1928, and was a very distinguished art director, but he had ambitions to become a director in his own right, and he ended up directing Things to Come, and Invaders from Mars, and all that sort of thing. Okay, sorry. Yeah, we'll keep that. Another more recent exhibition was the Ken Adams show at the Serpentine Gallery, curated by the art critic David Sylvester. In this, a selection of Ken Adams' concept sketches and production drawings, all made in a loose style with a Flowmaster pen, were shown against artfully arranged against a white wall as if they were old master drawings. Sketches from Dr. Strangelove, Goldfinger, You Only Live Twice, The Spy Who Loved Me, The Madness of King George, and so on. And in the middle of the gallery was a viewing room where clips from the finished film were screened. By missing out all the other stages in the visualization process and the ways in which these ideas were shared with the cinematographer and director and others, going straight from Ken's drawing to clip, the exhibition also tended to put the images on a pedestal, giving them an aesthetic status they were never supposed to have. I just want to give you an example, though, that the drawings can tell you certain things, though, about the production process. And I want to just take you through a little bit about the war room in Dr. Strangelove. Stanley Kubrick went to see Dr. No, 1962, and was particularly impressed by this set, the first appearance of the Doctor in voiceover. Remember, the Professor Dent goes and sits there and picks up the tarantula. This round sort of spider's web of light, which is very Ken, very expressionist, very 1920s Germany. And also the tubing, the gunmetal tubes that Sean Connery escapes through, and the nuclear reactor at the end, the water reactor. And he was also very taken with Dr. No's apartment, which is this strange mix. You get this strange mixture in Ken's sets for James Bond films of a sort of retro Renaissance palace for the baddie, but actually all this high-tech, shiny gantries and dials and nuclear reactors and people rushing around upstairs. So there's this funny collision between the high-tech weapons of mass destruction, and downstairs it's all very retro. In fact, the furniture mainly comes from Ken's living room. Here's the drawing of Dr. No's apartment. So Kubrick phones Ken Adam and says, "Will you do Dr. Strangelove?" And the original, well, here's the script. Just give an idea of what Ken had to go on. Where are we now? Yeah. Interior, impressive government building. Key personnel begin to arrive in cars which screech to a stop. Never in the movie, though Ken designed the cars, arriving underground in the Pentagon. Night, interior government building, hall, various shots. Officers hurrying about with their task. MPs guard restricted areas. Interior war room, sea photo of North American air defense. Early computers, dials, screens, like a space center. Late 1950s. Nerve center of tracking Soviet aircraft and the refueling of long-range B-52 bombers. There's a photo of everyone sitting in front of these consoles, very high-tech. A very large conference room. One wall is an enormous soundproof glass panel opening onto the various electronic displays in the war room. Enter President Merkin Muffley in a fury. Rising around a very large polished wood conference table are the chiefs of staff, etc., etc. So NORAD becomes this. The soundproof glass panel becomes the sloping map wall with the lights behind it, if you remember, plotting the aircraft. The polished wood conference table becomes a green baize poker table, which is very, very different. And the character of Buck Schmuck, who immediately opens his mouth, played by George C. Scott, changed to Buck Turgidson. Footnote in the script, the name Schmuck appears on page 1431 of the 1962 Manhattan Telephone Directory. Stanley Kubrick liked justifications for his names. Anyway, so you get that. That arrives on Ken's desk. So he starts off designing a two-level set with a sort of balcony. But they quickly realize, what are you going to do with that? There's lots of people who'll be standing around watching the action. He was also designing for an establishing shot of the war room to get the entire context of it underground, which never happened, very sensibly. They then decide no, so he starts doodling about a single-story war room. And you begin to get the sense of this vast space with its shiny black floor and its maps around the wall. Very much related to that Dr. No set of the spider's web. And it's really the sloping ceiling, which you never get in the film. This idea it's a concrete bunker underneath the Pentagon. You never get that sense because Kubrick, they did actually shoot an establishing shot, apparently, according to Ken, but they decided it's much better to make it claustrophobic. You're just going around the table with the light ring giving you the light source. You get a feeling, you don't quite know where you are. You don't have no sense of the scale of the room. But that's what the establishing shot would have looked like. That's what the movie looks like. There they are standing by the maps. Set photograph. And here's the famous sequence that was cut, which took a week to shoot, of a huge custard pie fight in the war room. If you remember, the film ends with a very abrupt cut from Strangelove standing up. Mein Führer, I can walk. And then you get a newsreel of nuclear explosions with Vera Lynn singing We'll Meet Again. It's a very odd cut. In between times, there was a huge custard pie fight. And it's the old gag of the president standing in the middle and not being touched by the custard pies. And some film buffs will recognize that because Blake Edwards, the director, apparently went to the preview of Strangelove, and the sequence turns up in The Great Race. Only it's Tony Curtis rather than the president. No one quite knows why Kubrick cut it. It is, in fact, in the National Film Archive, but no one's allowed to watch it. It might have been because eventually, you know, having avoided all the custard pies, the president stands there and gets one in the face, and George C. Scott says, "You have struck down the president in his prime." Kennedy was assassinated while they were doing post-production, and Kubrick might have cut it for taste reasons, or it may be that it didn't work. But anyway, that gives you an idea of the sort of thinking that's required even at the drawing stage. The studio approach to the history of film design certainly gets us closer to the processes involved. And the key year here, where Hollywood is concerned, was 1930, when the studios began to realize, as I've said, that a distinctive look to go with their distinctive logos would be useful for product differentiation. Charles Hall at Universal, Van Nest Paul Glaise left Paramount for RKO Radio in that year, where he supervised all those make-believe ballrooms and shiny black floors and deco palaces for Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers to dance in. Hans Dreyer, trained in German cinema under the influence of the Bahaus, took his place at Paramount. The Polish illustrator Anton Grot joined Warner Brothers, and the Irish-American architect Cedric Gibbons was already in charge of the art department at MGM, a position he held for over 30 years. And he seems to have been responsible for that studio's rich, evenly lit, well-upholstered look. All the directors, the major directors that worked at Metro, somehow the movies all look the same, to some extent. All these designers, who were known as supervising art directors, knew quite a lot about the latest design developments. And there's a very interesting book by a man called Donald Albrecht called Designing Dreams, which is all about how art historians have always claimed that the international modern style didn't reach America until a major exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1932. Actually, you look at Hollywood movies, for example, Grand Hotel of a year before, they'd been reading the magazines in Europe and were designing in the international modern style at least a year before the curators caught on. Because they had this sort of sense of what's the latest thing and how do you program it into... I mean, looking at avant-garde magazines means that the chances are that if a movie takes 8 months in those days, these days 18 months, to turn around, you might just hit the button when it comes out. That it's in the avant-garde now, but maybe it's gone mainstream by the time the film comes out. And that's exactly what happened with Grand Hotel. That while they were making it, it was all rather esoteric, international modern, but by the time the film came out, exhibitions in New York and all the rest of it. So that's, I think, an interesting aspect of production design. That's the actual foyer of the hotel, taken from the production drawing by Arnold Gillespie. Grand Hotel, 1932. And the supervising art directors, who were head of the art departments of the Hollywood studios, allocated designers to individual projects, signed off the drawings and blueprints, and line managed the unit art directors, whose name, as I've said, seldom appeared on the credits. From 1925 to 1953, the art director credit on every single MGM film went to Cedric Gibbons, rather than to the associate art director who actually worked on the project. 1,500 films in all, from Ben-Hur in 1925 to Julius Caesar in 1953. And during this period, Gibbons was nominated for 32 Academy Awards, and won 11 of them, for only one of which was the film that he'd actually designed. But he went up to receive the award. Ironically, he designed the Oscar, so at least he was being given an award that he'd designed, you know, the Crusader standing there on the spool of film. There was a clause in his contract which stated that his name had to represent the whole art department, which has created a problem for scholars, obviously, who did what. But it's also, strangely, encouraged scholars to relegate the supervising art directors lower than they should be. I think it's a fascinating case in design management, which needs studying. How did those departments work? You've got a manager who's got very strong aesthetic views, and you've got all the associate art directors who work on the individual projects, and somehow the design manager puts his stamp on all these films. I think that's a very interesting relationship at a time when we're interested in design management. So the supervising art directors do deserve more study. You can't just dismiss them. I mean, it wasn't megalomania. It was sort of bureaucratic shortcut, basically. I mean, today, you know, the credits take 10 minutes, as we know, and they hadn't got that much time in a 90-minute movie. It's interesting. There was an exhibition at the V&A in 1979 called The Art of Hollywood, and they wrote to Orson Welles saying, could he write an introduction to the catalogue, because they were featuring the head of design at RKO, Van Nest Paul Glees, as one of the case studies. And he wrote, they reproduced his letter as the foreword. It's absolutely marvellous. You should realise that in Hollywood, until the collapse of the studio system, the head of the art department was essentially a bureaucratic functionary and did little or none of the actual designing, for which he took credit and received the awards. Van Nest Paul Glees, for instance, was very good as an executive and administrator, but if he ever designed anything himself, I never saw it. Citizen Kane was entirely the work of Perry Ferguson, the associate art director. It was men like Ferguson who deserved to be brought out of obscurity, not the department heads who were no more designers of a movie than Louis B. Mayer was a director of one. Ironically, RKO were worried about what they thought was extravagance in the designing of the sets of Citizen Kane, and Perry Ferguson was fired shortly after the film came out. They thought he'd overdone it. As we'll see in a minute, he hadn't, but it looked as though he had. So, yeah. Am I okay? Yeah, just about okay, yeah. So distinctive look is interesting. Another aspect of the studio approach to film design was the sets themselves. Because in California, space in the early days wasn't a problem. So they left the sets standing on the back lot. Of course, today real estate is incredibly important, but of course virtual sets have virtually taken over. Although set building was budget bound, they still left a lot of standing sets. And a logical solution was to leave the set on the backlog, which after a few years began to resemble a surreal theme park, which of course some of them were eventually to become. A European street could do duty for a number of foreign countries with a few props and a bit of retouching. And a kind of collective memory was being fostered in the audience by recognition of certain studio landmarks. So here's the village from All Quiet on the Western Front, which was redressed for the Frankenstein films as the Mittel European town of Ingolstadt, with a few, props and so on. Then the Great Wall of Jerusalem from Cecil B. DeMille's King of Kings became the stockade on Skull Island in King Kong, which in turn became the buildings of Atlanta, which were set fire to in 1939 in Gone with the Wind. So what you're watching when you see Atlanta go up is the walls of the Great Wall of Jerusalem from King of Kings, because it was standing there and they didn't have much use for it anymore. One approach to the history of film design is to examine the genesis and development of individual sets and how they were reused. The classic in British cinema is Hammer, of course, where they used a country house near Bray and Black Park near Windsor. And they sort of do it from various different angles, but it's always the same house and always the same Black Park. And buffs enjoy spotting the reuse of these sets in different ways. Another is to look at the genesis of individual sets. And here, as I say, is there's a good example where, there's Atlanta going up. Oh, there's the standing set of Warner's of the New York street scene, which was still there in the 70s when Blade Runner was made, and it was turned into the Sid Mead designed street in Blade Runner, Lawrence Paul. Yeah. Citizen Kane again. In the Bible for Citizen Kane is a book called The Architecture of the Renaissance in Italy by a man called Anderson, with the staircase down the left and the entrance there. And the original idea for the Great Hall of Xanadu was to include the staircase down the left and the Gothic entrance in the middle and the fireplace on the right. So this was one of the initial drawings. They then decided that maybe they'd move the staircase into the middle because it would save money and you don't have to have quite such an elaborate set. So there's another drawing from the architecture of the Renaissance. And this rather strange drawing, although someone's written OK on it, it's a staircase that leads nowhere. You go straight into a window. It is a very strange set indeed. You go up this grand staircase, go past the statue, and you go slap bang into a window that's cut in half. But nevertheless, this was from the inspiration of the book. Then they decided, for budgetary reasons, to, instead of having a living room and a hall at Xanadu, they'd have both in one set. And they'd have as a proscenium arch this giant fireplace. So a lot would happen in front of the fireplace, like a proscenium arch in the theatre, and it would be both the living room and the hall with a shiny black floor. So you have the fireplace and the entrance, the Gothic entrance, put next to it. So Susan sits there doing her jigsaw puzzles. You've got the staircase. By the way, they found a Gothic entrance from some medieval epic at Archaeo, so they chucked that in for good measure, and a few sculptures from other films. But then they decided, if you put in the foreground a bit of Egyptian from another film and a bit of medieval from another film and covered the rest of the set with black drapes, there's nothing there. And you light it. So it gives the impression, with echo on the soundtrack, of a gigantic hall. Actually, it's just the entrance, the fireplace, and a couple of sculptures is all there is on the soundstage. So when Perry Ferguson was fired for extravagance, they'd really bought the idea that he'd spend a lot of money on this giant. Actually, he hadn't. It's very unfair, you know. I mean, he did okay afterwards, but it's a very interesting example of how tracking how the set evolved can tell you quite a lot about the circumstances of the production of the film. It's sort of grandiose, but actually it's a big illusion, virtually the entire film, with an awful lot of special effects for the period. So all these approaches to the subject have emerged just as the old procedures and crafts of set building in Hollywood have made way for CGI substitutes, and just as the real backlots are becoming virtual ones. As early as 1926, the French architect Robert Mallet-Stevens had attempted to sketch out the story of how film design had matured since its origins with Georges Méliès, fantasy sets, and the Lumière brothers, location dressing and open-air interiors, to the studio era. He offered these thoughts at an architectural conference, and it was published in a rather wonderful book called L'Art cinématographique by Mallet-Stevens. The sets for drama production, viewed in theatres, he said, were like paintings, fixed backdrops to be seen from a fixed viewpoint, with the audience as the fourth invisible wall. The sets for musicals and cabarets, with their graphic headlines and bright lights, were more like the representations of posters. The sets for film were much nearer to architecture, he said, where the viewer was often cast in the role of the actor. Up until about 1912, films had borrowed their flat backdrops and points of view from theatrical traditions. Then they had begun to break away from the stasis of the theatre with 3D sets and cameras snooping around them. Then in Hollywood, the studio system, first established in the late teens, led to the definitive break between the stage and the cinema, and to the positioning of film design within a collaborative industry. At this point, he says, the architecture of film itself became an actor. And by that he meant that you find out an awful lot, as I say, about the characters and the situation and the story, even before someone has opened their mouth. So another approach to this, where it does get complicated, and one or two of the books have tried this, is the relationship between film design and narrative. How does it serve the story? What is being encoded in these sets, and indeed in the costumes and everything else, which the script doesn't tell you? And how do you actually isolate that? Because that is the process. And Mallet-Stevens says basically that's the contribution of film. No longer a painted backdrop, but an actor in the story. And Fritz Lang said, you know, the great thing is that you know all about Mabuse before he enters because of the environment that he lives in, which of course Ken has been doing in James Bond films ever since. I just want to finish on a couple of very brisk case studies to illustrate some of the things that I mean. And the first is Metropolis, 1926, which was designed by three designers, Otto Hunter, Erich Kettelhut, and Karl Wohlbrecht, for Fritz Lang. And they read all the magazines about the latest architecture. In fact, the building in the middle is based on a glass tower designed by Mies van der Rohe, which had never in fact been built, but which was at the concept stage and was in the magazines in 1924 to 1926. So you've got the New York skyline, famously. You've got the latest German architecture. But here's the street in Metropolis, and it's very interesting that you see the cathedral, and Fritz Lang has written on it, "Kill the cathedral." It's spoiling everything. If you go to a modern city, or rather a modern city centre, because always with these modernist things, it's always the city centre, you can't have the cathedral. So instead, you have the Tower of Babel, this great helicopter pad in the middle. It's fascinating to see these two drawings, which are in Berlin, in the Film Museum, to see the actual thought processes in the film with this. And here they are doing the street scene for Metropolis. Louis Bunwell, when he saw it, said, you know, architects move over because films can deal with the way architecture interacts with the street in a way that architectural drawings can't. From now on, the movies are going to take over from architectural drawings. That was in 1927. Yeah. That's one of Kettelhut's drawings of the Tower of Babel. And this strange convention of having aeroplanes flying below the waterline, as it were, despite the updraft, which would have completely destroyed them, but it looks great. In these modernist things, you either have monorails or planes flying around very low, because it kind of looks modern. And 1936, H.G. Wells, I've written about this actually in the BFI Film Classics series, because I think as a design case study, it's really interesting. I mean, the story is about the world in 1936 turning into Everytown in 2036. So you've got the city centre built at Denham. It gets destroyed in the World War in 1940. This was made in 1936. And you get the middle section of the film, which is sort of neo-medievalism amongst the ruins. And then out of the ruins comes the new city. And they all look at New York and say, that's terribly out of date. They use glass, they use electricity, they use all these out-of-date things. We're going to be more advanced than that. It's sort of nuclear power, and they don't have windows. 1934, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, the Hungarian designer on the run from the Nazis, is in London. And they approach him to help with the design of Everytown. And a lot of the books say that he had a big influence on it. Actually, somebody, this is a great example of research, somebody found a rusting can of film at Denham, a film researcher called Lisa Pontecorvo, and it was all Moholy-Nagy's offcuts, and actually only about a minute of it appears in the film. But he had some wonderful ideas about transparent buildings and discs and light play, which is very like his avant-garde. This is what his city centre was supposed to look like. And they took one look at it and thought, we can't do that. Unfortunately, they didn't tell him, and he went to the premiere and was rather shocked. I think he told everyone that he'd had a huge effect, rather like Christopher Lee in The Lord of the Rings, and discovered he'd disappeared, in the last one. Anyway, this is a bit of Moholy-Nagy. But basically, they got their ideas from Le Corbusier. The bit in the background is from one of Corbusier's books called Vers une architecture, royalty-free, one presumes, and various books about American modern architecture. Here they are, in prefabricated parts, and here's Everytown in 2036, which bears a startling resemblance to those hotels built in the 1960s in the Middle West, where you get this strange atrium with a lift in them. It's absolutely extraordinary. But anyway, Vincent Corder was the art director. It's a very good example, though. Vincent Corder was a painter, worked with his brother Alexander, but actually the art director of this film was William Cameron Menzies, who was the director. Had very, very strong views, but there's a tug of war between them. Okay, so there's lots of opportunities, ladies and gentlemen, to do research in production design. I think it's very important as a neglected piece of the jigsaw. There's the fine art approach, there's the studio approach, there's the biographical approach, there's the individual set approach, there's the life of sets approach, there's the design management approach. There's all, I mean, I've talked just about Hollywood, but of course there's many, I'm sure other people are going to talk later on. And, but I go back to Michael Powell's point that, I mean, I've just done this exhibition on Hollywood costume, and I'd make huge claims for Hollywood costume, but it is not as important as this subject in terms of the visual coordination of films. The costumes are very important, they serve a purpose, but they are kind of subordinate to the environment that they appear in. So over to you to all come up with, and indeed interviewing elderly production designers and associate art directors, because I think there's a real opportunity there, you know, I think both of us have experienced what happens when you leave it too late. You know, it's very frustrating when you interview a wonderful art director and he's sort of lost it, and you want him to talk in detail, but we've left it too late. They're in their 80s, they're in their 90s. If only we'd got to them when they're in their 60s and 70s, when you know, you could show drawings to them and it would stimulate their memories and all the rest of it. But anyway, over to you. Thank you very much.
We've got, where are we? 5 minutes, so a few minutes before lunch. If anyone has any questions, comments, responses.
Ian, I'm sure you don't agree with all of it, but...
I feel quite overwhelmed what you've just been talking about, actually, because I am a production designer working obviously in the UK, and I started, well, I've been working for 25 years in industry, and the first thing I'd just like to relate to all of you is just, it's incredibly hard work. So you are literally leaving the house at 5 in the morning, working. You can just work 3 months straight through, and you never really ever have time to sit back and sort of reflect on your practice at all. And just in the last few years, when I was really starting to find the juggling between family and industry very difficult, I've taken a step back and I'm doing a very, very part-time PhD, trying to sort of look at my practice through maybe the eyes of you guys. And I was finding it quite staggering that so little is covered, when I know through my work as a collaborator, you know, we do sort of provide so much of the story world, if you like. So I think it's brilliant that there's an interest developing in this, but I have to admit I'm still struggling where to sort of put myself, really, because I will sit through a lot of media sort of theory lectures and hear nothing about the designer and all about the auteur all the time. And as an industry practitioner, I do find that quite extraordinary sometimes. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say, really.
Sorry, if I could lob something into the brand tub, then I think Christopher's opened up a wonderful range of perspectives, just like it says on the tin. But just something to toss in, and maybe some of those, particularly practitioners here, might be able to shed some light on this. Something I've discovered in my digging around in the art department is something which is an absolutely key tool that people like to use, have used as far as I can tell, for at least 20 years, maybe longer. It's called a mood board. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, we always do.
Where does the mood board begin?
When you get the script?
No. Historically.
Oh, historically.
I know the job it does today. It's pretty central to the design process.
Yeah.
But
do you think it's son of the Bible? Yeah. Because the Bibles were basically mood boards, and they go back to the late 20s. Maybe, you know, because this is a sort of visual world that roughly inspirations, thoughts, you know, the visual world that the film. So in a way, mood boards are, I think, the grandsons of the Bibles. Don't you think?
I assume so.
Yeah.
I mean, I just wonder when people started referring to it.
Yeah.
I know that there's a reference somewhere in John Box's career, because he's the man I've studied closely, to a mood board. And I know that all designers today use them. That's the first thing you do, is to construct a mood board, and you ship it around in front of the execs and the commissioners. And I'm sure that they're migrating onto iPads even as we speak. Although they're actually quite physical, still, often in my observation. I just wonder when did they start being used in Hollywood? I think perhaps not. Are they European developments?
Or post-studio in America, where each project gets built up with a team rather than belonging in-house to the studios, where, you see, I mean, that's one of the big changes, isn't it? Is where you've got, you know, till the mid-50s, you've got a huge department of supervising art director and all associates, seamstresses, tailors, and all that. So you've got to feed that in-house department, and there's a kind of assembly line which feeds it. But all those resources are there, and the Bible, sort of, off you go, you know. And then when all that collapses, where each project is a team of people you trust and you've worked with before, like Scorsese, Sandy Powell, and etc., Dante, And maybe the mood board comes at that point where you've got to sort of invent the world from scratch each time rather than depending on an infrastructure. I don't know, but that would make sense, wouldn't it?
The thing we would do always is just in our offices, because we're always in completely different offices all over the place that we take over, but we would surround our offices in all the images that we're trying to recreate for the narrative, so everything is there, all over, all the location photos, and then we sort of edit it down into more of a sort of mood board. Edit it into what actually becomes what we shoot.
Yeah, the distillation.
Yeah, the distillation.
And hasn't it got something to do with the style of the work, the way the designer works as well? That more would refer to mood boards than maybe another. And yes, it might be a modern term, and the old term was the Bible, and the modern term is the mood board.
I think to some extent, but I think that as a general rule, all designers and art department people in general will like to work with that kind of visual reference, and I think it's just something that comes back from art school, from whatever particular discipline that you've trained in. You're used to doing all that. It's visual research, isn't it? So.
I just come back to the idea of the Bible. I mean, the fact that it's actually gone is problematic, because we know that they are still used. And I mean, there's the famous example of Gladiator, where Ridley Scott is pitched Gladiator by being shown a photostat of Felice Verso, Jean-Léo Gérôme's picture, and then interviewed on the extras is Arthur Max. And he sat in front of his drawing board, and there is the catalogue raisonné. And basically, the catalogue raisonné is the Bible for Gladiator. To the extent that the same mistakes that Gérôme was making in the 19th century come up in Gladiator. And I have a related question to that, which was that I do agree that the absence of interest in it is partly due to auteurism and the development of auteurism and its kind of the legacy of literature studies and so on. But I also wonder that there isn't also a problem with art school education and to a certain extent design. I remember being interviewed for a position at an art school, saying I want to go into how design is networked and about how creative people work in networks and how employability is relied upon the studio, and being told we just don't do that here. We teach our designers and artists to be basically craftspeople, and there is still a particular kind of ethos that you will enter freelance work. You will be the intender of meaning of your work, but we actually know that design doesn't work like that at all. And as soon as they get there's a big cliff edge. So it occurs to me that maybe there's something to do with art and design education as well as film studies.
No, I think that's true. And in fact, I mean, just taking my ex-institution, the Royal College, Ridley and Tony Scott came through graphic design. And a graphic design department is actually much better at teamwork because you're working for a client, you're possibly doing a poster or an ad. You know, you're used to the idea that two isn't a crowd. Whereas in product design and crafts and some of the others, the individual creativity is everything. And you're not used to working in a team, and you resent it and find it quite difficult. And I think it is a great flaw in British art that you kind of build up everyone's ego to a huge extent, which makes them very difficult to employ sometimes. So oddly enough, most of the art directors that actually Anton Furst came from, he came from architecture, which again is used to working in teams, but not from the heartland of the crafts and product design. I don't think any art directors have come from that area, graphics and architecture, because it's more team-based and you learn how to compromise and how to get on with other people, you know. So those tend to be the two. And in a way it was ever thus, you know. Most of the Hollywood art directors were either architect or interior design trained, as you say, although one or two were illustrators. Great at mood boards, you know. Nearly all had been to college. But I think you've got a very good point there. And we could have nourished British production design much more from art schools in the way that other areas have been nourished if only they could learn to work with other people. Yeah, it's interesting.
I'd just like to throw in a very minor defence of film historians and theorists throughout the 80s, in so far as perhaps issues in production design have been latent rather than manifest. So a lot of film theorists and historians have brought up issues of production design that they've never been synthesised.
Yes.
So Stephen Heath's very famous piece on narrative space comes to mind. particularly the scenes in Suspicion, where he talks about relationships between certain chemicals and the big web that comes through the window. Is very interesting. And the only other one I could think of off the top of my head was the beginning of David Bordwell's book. I think it's Figures Traced in Light, when the key argument is going through several examples of how to film a dinner scene. You know, where do you put the camera, how design a space so that the characters and the conversations can be filmed. So granted, these aren't specifically put into a basket of production design, but I reckon if you went back through the books, you could find a lot of interesting examples of those kinds of...
Yes, although very often they're attributed to a single intelligence, which is the director. Which is the problem, I think. I mean, I agree with you. People have described the visual world of films, but thinking it's a single controlling intelligence behind it, and therefore it relates to the script and the vision of the director in a very direct way, rather than being an actual contributor. But you're right, yes, people have referred to it. I mean, there was a book that was, when I was a student, was a big man called Léon Barsac, who was a French writer, called Caligari's Cabinet and Other Grand Illusions, where it's rather a sweet book, because it, first of all, because most of the illustrations are French, but also where he predicts that sets will disappear because films are going to be in the streets from now on, and cinema verite and wobbly scope, and we're all going to shoot in the streets. Of course, immediately afterwards comes CGI, where everything goes back into the studio and everything becomes artificial. But he predicted the opposite would happen, that basically neo-realism would become the dominant aesthetic, and so on. So it's a very interesting book, and that was about production designers. But yes, there are isolated examples. My point, though, is that the literary model tends not to foreground the visual in the way you need to when looking at this. I mean, and also the fact that there's an awful lot of archaeology to be done just to get to the point where director studies were about 1956, you know, where people knew a lot about directors and cahiers, but all that work still needs to be done, really, you know. But yeah, the other thing is that the picture books that you referred to nearly always refer to the same films. I mean, there are certain well-known archives. You know, The Wizard of Oz was hugely well documented. So was Kane. So was Gone with the Wind. And so the books retread those films over and over and over again, because there's very nice pictures and all the rest of it. But someone needs to get outside the obvious. And it is obvious. Science fiction, I mean, I use Blade Runner and Metropolis, but that's a bit obvious in a way. They're obviously designed because they're future films. And much more interesting is, as we were talking, is Mildred Pierce or something, where the design is sort of mundane and much more interesting in a way. I mean, in the Hollywood Costume Show, we made the point that Bruce Willis's T-shirt in Die Hard required just as much thought for the costume designer as Gladiator. But people think it just happened. But actually, an enormous amount of thought goes into contemporary costume because of the encoded meanings, where the audience, in fact more in some ways, because they know the audience can identify with it directly, as in historical reconstruction. And yet, all the historical reconstructions always get the Oscar, because it looks designed. And you don't have to explain, you know, Gladiator, whatever it is, Barry Lyndon, Gladiator, they always, Madness of King George. Madness of King George, which was Ken Adams' least characteristic film he ever made, was the one he gets an Oscar for, and Barry Lyndon.
You just made, Christopher, it's interesting though, about not having to worry about the detail, because people can pick up on it. And there's a technical point which I think is latent in what you've been saying, which is that people have tended to use the same films and the same stills back in the day when the stills were something that you acquired as a piece of paper, say. But the fact that you can now produce your own stills, either from DVD or from YouTube, means that there's actually no limit to the possibility of looking at what's actually in the frame, as opposed to what is usually a production photograph. So the world is even more open to looking at what's actually on the screen, irrespective of deciding who put it there. But at least you can see what is literally in front of you.
That's true. And I've seen quite a lot of undergraduate theses where, you know, frame grabs doing an anatomy of a particular scene is absolutely enthralling. Like those old Annabelle books, you know, where, you remember those pictorial versions of films? Probably before your time, but he did a whole series of frame blow-ups to tell the story of Frankenstein. I think they're enthralling when they're done properly, I think. That's a good point. Great opportunities for everyone, yeah.
Okay, I think we'll call this to a halt there.